Summer, 1944. Fort McCall, Texas, a place so secret it isn't even on the map. The air is hot and heavy. It smells like dust and diesel fuel. Inside a small concrete building, fans spin slowly over rows of young women. Some are barely out of school. They bend over strange machines, humming songs to pass the time. They think they are helping win the war, one quiet day at a time. They have no idea they are sitting inside one of the war's darkest secrets. One woman has a backache that won't go away. That simple pain will crack this secret wide open. Not with a bomb, not with a gunshot, just one X-ray held up to the light, and she won't be the only one. This is not a story about what these women did for their country. It's a story about what their country hid from them, and what it took years and real courage to finally bring into the light. Before we go further, if stories like this matter to you, hit like and subscribe. It helps keep these hidden histories alive. Now, stick around, because some of the biggest battles in history were never fought with guns at all. The heat in Fort McCall never seemed to break, not even after sundown, and by the summer of 1944, the young women who worked the day shift had learned to live inside it, sweat soaking through cotton uniforms, the smell of scorched dust drifting through open windows, the low drone of ceiling fans that never quite won the fight against the Texas sun. Among them was a woman whose name would later appear, quietly and without fanfare, in a stack of medical files marked for review. For now, she was simply tired. Her back ached in a way that sleep didn't fix, a dull, grinding pain low in her spine that she assumed came from long hours bent over a workstation. She mentioned it almost as an afterthought during a routine physical, expecting the kind of answer every overworked wartime employee expected: rest, aspirin, and back to the line tomorrow. The doctor who examined her did not expect anything unusual either. Back pain was common on the base. Women stood for 10, sometimes 12 hours a day, moving materials whose exact nature was never explained to them, only that the work was essential and the schedules were non-negotiable. It was the kind of complaint a physician could diagnose in his sleep. He ordered a standard X-ray, the same procedure he'd performed dozens of times that month alone, expecting to see nothing more than the ordinary wear of a body pushed too hard for too long. What came back on the film stopped him. There was something there, faint, unfamiliar, inconsistent with simple muscular strain. It didn't match the pattern of a pulled muscle or a compressed disc. It looked, if anything, like a shadow that had no business being on a 22-year-old woman's spine. He said nothing to her. He ordered a second X-ray, telling her it was standard procedure, a phrase that meant nothing and explained everything he didn't want to say aloud. When the second image matched the first, he ordered a third. Still, he told her nothing. This was not negligence, it was the particular caution of a man who understood he had stumbled onto something outside the boundaries of what he was permitted to know. Fort McCall's operations were compartmentalized by design. Doctors treated symptoms, not causes. Workers followed instructions, not explanations. Wartime secrecy did not exist only in code rooms and command tents. It lived in the space between a doctor's diagnosis and the truth he was allowed to speak. She left that day with a vague promise of further tests and no real answers, unaware that she had just become the first thread in a mystery that would take decades to fully unravel. She went back to her station the next morning, back to the same long hours, the same unnamed materials passing through her hands, the same quiet hum of machines that no one around her fully understood. In her diary, recovered years later by relatives piecing together her story, she wrote simply, "The doctor seemed worried, but wouldn't say why. Told me to come back Thursday. I don't know what there is to worry about. I feel fine." Mostly, she felt fine. That was the paradox at the heart of everything that followed a woman in perfect health, according to every sensation her own body could report, carrying inside her the earliest physical evidence of a danger the human eye could never detect, and the human hand could never feel. The X-ray hadn't found an injury. It had found a warning. And warnings, in a place built on secrecy, had a way of disappearing before anyone outside a locked office ever saw them. But this was only the beginning. Word travels slowly on a base built for silence, but medical charts have their own quiet momentum. The doctor who had ordered that third X-ray couldn't shake the image from his mind, the strange shadow that didn't belong, sitting inside the spine of a woman who otherwise showed no signs of illness. Rather than let the case close as an unsolved oddity, he did something almost instinctive for a man trained to look for patterns. He pulled files. Not just hers. Every woman from her unit who had come through the infirmary in the past 6 months. What he found unsettled him more than the original X-ray ever had. Buried among routine complaints, fatigue, headaches, minor colds were 4 other cases of unexplained back pain. Then a 5th. Then a 6th. Each one, taken alone, looked like nothing more than the ordinary toll of physical labor. A woman in her early 20s, standing for long shifts, complaining of soreness, hardly the stuff of medical alarm. But laid side by side, the files told a different story. The women were all roughly the same age, between 19 and 26. They worked the same rotating schedule. They occupied the same building, a squat, windowless structure at the edge of the base that most personnel referred to only by a numbered designation, never a name. And each one, when asked to describe her pain, used almost identical language, a deep ache in the bones, not the muscles, worse at night, unrelieved by rest. 6 cases. Then, within the week, 2 more surfaced from a colleague's files. Women who had complained of the same symptoms but had never been connected to the others because no one had thought to ask the right question. By the time the doctor laid all 8 folders across his desk, the numbers had stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like evidence. Wartime medicine dealt constantly in probability. Of the thousands of young workers on any given base, some percentage would always report vague aches, respiratory trouble, fatigue. Statistically, isolated cases meant nothing. But 8 cases from the same 40-person unit, all sharing the same peculiar signature on film, defied ordinary explanation. The odds of that occurring by chance, as later reviewers would calculate, were vanishingly small, closer to 1 in several thousand than the kind of coincidence a physician could responsibly dismiss. He began writing careful notes, the kind meant for a superior's desk rather than a patient's file. In the margin of one report, preserved decades later in declassified base records, he wrote a single line that would echo through everything that followed: common exposure suspected. Source unknown. Request permission to inspect Building 14. He did not yet know what Building 14 was. He knew only that it was where all 8 women worked, and that whatever passed through their hands each day seemed to be leaving a mark no rest or medicine could erase. One nurse who assisted with the exams later recalled the moment the pattern became undeniable, not through official records, but through something smaller and more human. They started comparing notes themselves, she said. One girl said, "You too?" to another in the hallway, and neither one of them was joking anymore. That's when I knew this wasn't ordinary tiredness. Tiredness doesn't spread from one file to the next like a fingerprint. It was a small moment, 2 co-workers exchanging a nervous glance in a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and dust, but it marked the exact point where individual suffering became collective mystery. What had looked, one file at a time, like the unremarkable wear of wartime labor, now looked gathered together. Like the outline of something far larger, hidden just behind a door with no name. The doctor filed his request to inspect Building 14 that same afternoon, confident it was a formality. He had no idea It would be the last straightforward request he'd ever make on this case. The request should have taken a day, maybe two. Base inspections were routine, a matter of forms, signatures, and a brief walkthrough with a supervising officer. Instead, the doctor's memo disappeared into a chain of command that seemed to grow longer and vaguer the further it traveled. A week passed with no answer. Then two. When he finally received a response, it wasn't the access he'd asked for. It was a single sentence, typed and unsigned: Building 14 is not available for medical inspection at this time. Not available. Not restricted, not classified, not explained, simply unavailable, as though the building itself had decided to close its doors to scrutiny. He pressed further, requesting at minimum a conversation with the officer overseeing operations there. That request went unanswered entirely. What he discovered next was stranger still. When he tried to locate Building 14 on the base's official facilities roster, the document every physician had access to for sanitation and safety inspections, it wasn't listed. Not omitted by accident, not filed under a different number. It simply did not exist on paper. Despite standing in plain concrete and steel less than half a mile from his own office, despite the fact that 8 women under his care walked through its doors every single morning. This was the paradox that would come to define the entire investigation. A building that dozens of people entered daily, one that shaped their schedules, their health, their exhaustion, and yet, according to the very institution that ran it, a building that did not officially exist. Wartime secrecy operated on exactly this kind of quiet contradiction. Compartmentalization wasn't just a security strategy, it was a form of erasure, in which entire operations could be hidden not by lying about them, but by simply refusing to write them down. Roughly 6,000 workers were employed in similarly classified or semi-classified capacities across smaller American installations during the war. Many of them, like the women of Fort McCall, with no clear understanding of what their labor actually involved. The doctor began asking the women themselves, carefully, without alarming them. Their answers only deepened the mystery. They described long shifts moving materials packed into small containers, following exact procedures they'd been trained to repeat without ever being told why. They wore gloves, sometimes masks, though the reasoning given was vague dust control. One supervisor had said, an explanation that satisfied no one who thought too hard about it. None of them had been told what the material was. None had thought to ask. In a culture built on wartime obedience and quiet patriotism, questioning your assignment wasn't just discouraged, it bordered on suspicious. One worker, interviewed decades later for a survivor's oral history project, remembered the atmosphere precisely. We were told it was for the war effort, and that was enough for us. You didn't ask what you were carrying, you just carried it. Asking questions felt like admitting you weren't trustworthy. Her voice, recorded on aging tape, carried the particular weariness of someone recounting a memory she'd turned over in her mind 1,000 times, searching for a clue she might have missed. The doctor now faced a case unlike anything in his training. He had 8 patients showing an identical, unexplained pattern of harm, a workplace he couldn't inspect, records that refused to acknowledge that workplace existed, and workers who couldn't tell him what they handled, because they themselves had never been told. Every question he asked seemed to loop back to the same locked door. It was no longer a medical mystery. It had become something closer to an investigation one, where the evidence kept slipping just out of reach the moment he got close. But that was only the beginning of how far the silence would go. If the denial of access to Building 14 had been the first wall, what happened next felt like the ground shifting beneath the doctor's feet entirely. He returned to his office one morning to find the folder of 8 cases, the one he had built meticulously over weeks, cross-referencing symptoms, work schedules, and X-ray results missing from his filing cabinet. not misplaced. Missing, the cabinet itself showed no sign of forced entry, no disorder, nothing to suggest an accident. Someone with access to his office had removed the files cleanly and completely, down to the carbon copies he'd kept in a separate drawer as a precaution. He requested duplicates from the base records office. He was told, politely but firmly, that no such records existed in their system, a claim directly contradicted by the fact that he himself had filed the originals there only weeks earlier. When he pushed for an explanation, he was redirected to an administrative officer he'd never met, who informed him, without elaboration, that the matter was being handled at a higher level and that further inquiries were not advisable at this time. Scheduled follow-up appointments for the 8 women began disappearing from the infirmary calendar almost overnight. 2 of the women who had been due for re-examination that week found their appointments simply cancelled, with no rescheduling offered. When one asked the front desk why, she was told there had been an administrative error, the same vague phrase that seemed to explain everything and nothing at once. A colleague of the doctor's, a younger physician who had assisted with several of the exams, was quietly transferred to a different post entirely, over 1,000 miles away, with less than a week's notice. No formal reason was given. His personnel file, reviewed decades later by historians, listed only a single word under cause: reassignment. This was the moment the case stopped being simply unexplained and became something closer to suppressed. There is a particular kind of unease that settles over an investigator, even an accidental one, even a small-town-based doctor with no training in intelligence or secrecy, when the evidence he's gathering begins vanishing faster than he can protect it. It's not paranoia, it's pattern recognition. In roughly 11 documented cases across similarly classified wartime facilities, medical staff who pursued unexplained illness clusters among workers reported nearly identical experiences: missing files, sudden transfers, and instructions from unnamed superiors to let the matter rest. The doctor began keeping his own private notes at home that summer, a habit he'd never needed before, writing case details from memory into a personal notebook rather than trusting them to official channels. In one entry, later recovered by his family and donated to a regional archive, he wrote, "I begin to feel less like a physician and more like a man trying to remember a crime before the evidence disappears." It was an extraordinary admission for someone whose entire professional identity rested on trusting the systems around him: record-keeping, chain of command, institutional protection of patients. Those systems, he was discovering, could be turned inside out with a single unsigned memo. The 8 women, meanwhile, had no idea any of this was happening. They continued reporting to Building 14 each morning, unaware that their own medical histories were being erased from the very institution meant to safeguard them. Their pain was not being denied, it was simply being unrecorded, filed into a gap where it would be almost impossible for anyone, years later, to prove it had ever been reported at all. What had begun as a medical mystery had now revealed its second, more disturbing layer. Someone, somewhere above the doctor's authority, did not want this illness remembered. But erasing the paperwork could not erase what was happening to the women's bodies, and soon an outside expert would begin looking for answers the files could no longer provide. With the paper trail collapsing around him, the doctor did something that broke from ordinary protocol entirely. He reached outside the medical chain of command and quietly contacted a physicist attached to a nearby research unit. A man with no formal role in patient care, but a reputation for asking questions no one else dared to ask. It was an unusual pairing: a physician and a physicist, standing over the same set of unexplained symptoms, each bringing a kind of knowledge the other lacked. The physicist reviewed what remained of the case notes, the ones the doctor had kept privately, and asked a question that reframed the entire investigation. Not what disease is this, but what kind of injury leaves no mark at all. It was, in its own way, An obvious question, and that was precisely why no one had asked it. Every conventional pathway of harm the base had considered left evidence a physician could recognize: burns from chemical exposure, respiratory damage from smoke or fumes, skin irritation from handling caustic materials. But the 8 women showed none of it. No scarring, no blistering, no chemical odor lingering on clothing, no coughing, no visible sign that anything had ever touched them at all. Whatever was affecting their bodies wasn't leaving behind the kind of clues a trained eye could see, smell, or feel. The physicist began asking about the materials moving through Building 14, not what they were called, since no one seemed willing to say, but how they were handled. Small lead-lined containers, strict time limits on handling shifts, mandatory glove use even for tasks that seemed to involve no liquids or powders, frequent, unexplained instrument checks conducted by men in different uniforms than the rest of the base, men who rarely spoke to the workers directly. Piece by piece, the details formed a shape the physicist recognized immediately, even without official confirmation: the signature of radioactive material, handled under wartime secrecy so total that even the doctors treating its victims weren't permitted to know its name. It was, statistically, an almost invisible danger. Roughly 600 milliroentgens of unshielded exposure per week, a dose historians would later estimate for similar wartime handling conditions, produced no immediate sensation whatsoever. No heat, no pain, no visible change to skin or tissue. The human body, remarkably, had no built-in alarm system for this particular kind of harm. A worker could absorb dangerous, cumulative exposure over months without a single symptom warning her that anything was wrong, until the damage had already reached deep into bone and marrow. The physicist put it plainly in a note passed privately to the doctor, one that survived in his personal files rather than any official record. You are treating patients for a war wound with no wound. The battlefield they worked on had no explosions, no smoke, no enemy in sight. And that may be exactly why no one has stopped it. For the doctor, this reframed everything he thought he understood about the case. He had spent weeks searching for a visible cause, a chemical, a contaminant, a physical injury from repetitive labor, because that was the only kind of harm his training had prepared him to recognize. The real answer had been invisible from the very beginning, not hidden by conspiracy alone, but hidden by the simple, terrifying limits of human perception. One nurse who later reflected on this turning point described it starkly: we kept looking for something we could see. It never occurred to us the enemy might be something we couldn't. The paradox settled over the investigation like a fog. These women had spent their days believing they were serving safely behind the front lines, far from bullets and shrapnel, while quietly absorbing an injury more patient, more silent, and in some ways more merciless than anything on a battlefield. There had been no explosion, no impact, no moment of danger they could point to and say, that was when it happened. There had only been the slow, undetectable accumulation of harm, one ordinary shift at a time. The physicist's involvement gave the doctor something he'd been missing for weeks: not proof, not yet, but direction. If the enemy was invisible, then the fight to expose it would have to be fought entirely on paper, in records and in testimony, since no wound would ever appear to make the case for them. But identifying the danger was only the beginning. The women still had no idea what they were working with, and neither, it turned out, had anyone bothered to tell them. If the physicist's theory was correct, then the next question was unavoidable: did the women themselves know what they were handling? The doctor began asking them directly, carefully, framing his questions as routine follow-up rather than the quiet investigation it had become. Their answers, gathered one by one, painted a picture that was less a cover-up in the dramatic sense and more something quieter and, in its own way, more disturbing: a system built so that no single person, including the workers themselves, ever held enough information to understand the whole. They knew procedures. They did not know substances. They had been trained to handle small containers with specific tools, to limit their time near certain workstations, to wear gloves without gaps at the wrist, to never eat or drink at their desks, rules presented as basic wartime discipline rather than warnings about a specific hazard. When asked what material passed through their hands each day, the most common answer was a shrug, followed by some version of, "We were told it was for the war effort," and that was enough. Roughly 90% of workers in comparable classified wartime roles across the country later reported, in post-war surveys and oral histories, that they had never been told the specific nature of the materials they handled, only the procedures required to handle them. This was not incompetence, it was design. Compartmentalized secrecy meant that information was distributed only on a strict need-to-know basis, and workers performing repetitive physical tasks were judged by the standards of wartime security to need to know almost nothing. The materials scientists who developed the substances knew. The military officials who authorized their use knew. The workers who spent 8, 10, 12 hours a day in physical contact with them did not a hierarchy of knowledge that placed the people at greatest physical risk at the very bottom of the chain of who was told anything at all. One surviving letter, written by one of the 8 women to her sister and preserved by family for decades, captured the atmosphere with unsettling calm. They tell us it's important, and I believe them. I don't need to know what it is to know it matters. That's what serving means, isn't it? Trusting that they know best. She wrote this only weeks before her own diagnosis, a letter that reads, in hindsight, less like patriotic devotion and more like a portrait of exactly how trust could be quietly weaponized against the people offering it. The doctor found himself wrestling with a moral question that had no clean answer. Classified wartime secrecy had a legitimate purpose: protecting technology, protecting strategy, protecting lives on distant battlefields from an enemy who might exploit any leaked detail. But that same secrecy, applied without limit, had also protected something else entirely: the silence surrounding a health risk borne by the very people the war effort depended on. The materials classification hadn't just kept it hidden from spies, it had kept it hidden from the doctors treating its victims and the workers absorbing its effects. A silence with no enemy on the other side of it at all. This was the paradox the physicist had already sensed, and the doctor now confronted directly. The women hadn't been endangered because they lacked patriotism, hadn't been harmed because they'd ignored a warning. They had been harmed precisely because they had followed every instruction perfectly, trusted every assurance completely, and asked no questions exactly as they'd been trained to do. Their obedience, the very quality the war effort prized most, had become the mechanism of their own injury. It would be years before any of them learned the true nature of what they had carried each day. By then, the damage inside their bodies had already been accumulating, silent and unannounced, for far longer than anyone outside a locked office had been willing to admit. The war would end soon. For these women, the story was only just beginning.